Welcome to this new series of podcasts produced by the Institute for European Environmental Policy. I'm Michael Nicholson and I'm the head of the UK's environmental policy at IEEP. We're a non-profit organisation with over 40 years of experience advancing impact-driven sustainability policy across the EU and the world. In 2019, IEEP established a network of think tanks called Think Sustainable Europe, which informs and engages policymakers at member state and EU level about key environmental sustainability debates. COP26 concluded a few weeks ago now, with optimism for some and disappointment for others. In this podcast, we try to untangle several complex discussions and give an overview of what COP26 meant. We have a lot to cover today, so let's dive in. Today, I'm joined by a panel of experts from the Think Sustainable Europe network. Arne Riedel is Senior Fellow at the Ecologic Institute and Coordinator of the Institute's legal team. Arne is supporting the German and EU delegations in the climate negotiations on the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement since 2016, and is co-coordinating the EU's legal expert team. Since 2020, Arne is also a member of the Kyoto Protocol Compliance Committee's enforcement branch. Philip Gass is from the International Institute for Sustainable Development and leads their Transitions in Energy programme. His recent work has focused on development of fiscal policy approaches that facilitate greenhouse gas mitigation, including carbon pricing and subsidy reform. Philip also works directly on economic approaches that promote sustainability, including the green economy, circular economy, and just transitions. Okay, so let's get started. Is there a kernel of truth to Greta Thunberg's dismissal of COP26 as a failure of action? Or are there grounds for optimism that global action on climate change is turning a corner? Let's start with you, Arne.
Thank you very much, Michael, for having me, and thanks for the question. It really depends. So indeed, there is a kernel of truth, I would say. But of course, the assessment of the COP26 and its outcomes depends on the expectations, what this meeting actually entails. And being part of the negotiation team of the European Union, I'm more involved in the technical and legal negotiations. What these negotiations also entail are also political commitments and declarations, but also, of course, the whole underbelly of networking meetings, of press conferences, of side events as well. So looking at these three different main aspects of the COP26 and what they are convening, there can be very different levels of expectations. And looking at the annual technical work, I think we've done some progress. We've completed the Paris rulebook, for instance, on the market mechanisms in Article 6. We've closed some gaps in the transparency framework, and also have a decision on the common timeframes for the nationally determined contributions. So you could say the technical work proceeded as expected. It took a bit, but we got there in the end. But then again, you also have to see and understand, of course, where Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Futures and many other levels of civil society are coming from. And from their angle, I can completely understand the lack of ambition in some sorts when it comes to political declarations, because they need to be met by national commitments and national implementation. This is also where we really need to see some action in the upcoming years. So bottom line, it's a yes and no. There's a kernel of truth. We need more action in the implementation, which needs to come from the national level. But coming from the legal and technical side of negotiations, it's an annual process. And I think there has been some substantial progress being made, also giving voices to, for instance, indigenous peoples, which are part of the process and continue their work under the platform.
Thank you, Arne. Philip, your view?
Well, my answer really is yes to both questions. I think there are grounds for optimism, but also grounds for pessimism. The COP process, by its general nature, is shades of gray. It's not all black and white. This is the way that a process works when you have over 180 countries all have to agree on something. There's always the risk that we go to what's considered the lowest common denominator. However, I do believe that that lowest common denominator is significantly higher than it was even 5 years ago. As an example, it's true that we didn't get an agreement to phase out coal. Instead, we talk about phasing down coal. But I couldn't have possibly imagined even a few years ago that those words, be it phase down or phase out, either of them would be included in a COP agreement. And I think that that's quite substantial. With that said, I don't criticize the opinions and the actions of youth activists. It's because of them and because of their energy and the other civil society actors that are involved that we do have that progress that we have today. They're the ones that are pushing the decision makers to make progress, and they're always going to demand more from world leaders, as they should. One of the things that I tend to go back to is something that was told to me by a friend who works in funding climate change. And he said, my personal belief is that we're winning this war, or we're winning this battle against climate change. But he was also despaired that we weren't winning it fast enough, that we were having progress, and that we were seeing major developments that we maybe didn't anticipate. But at the end, we're still behind the calendar and the timeline that we need to achieve 1.5 degrees. So from that perspective, I can certainly understand the frustration that comes out of some of the activists that were involved at the COP, that countries didn't agree on more substantial and most importantly, quicker timeframes for some of the commitments that were made at the COP.
So let's touch on finance. At the COP26, there was an agreement to establish the Glasgow dialogue to discuss potential arrangements for the funding of activities. What potential future do you see for the loss and damage financial facility going forward? Philip, may I come to you on this one?
I can't necessarily see too far into the future, so I don't know what the exact outcome will be. But like other issues, I see that the opening discussion over past years on the topic of loss and damage, which I've been attending COPs for over a decade now, and when I started, this discussion was a non-starter for a lot of countries. So to see that opening up a little bit is positive, even if it remains unresolved. And the nature of the COP negotiations is that everything is tied together. Without an agreement on finance, we don't have an agreement on NDCs or on timelines or on adaptation or on other issues. So as we make progress on issues like meeting global climate finance goals, we are more likely to see progress in areas such as loss and damage. Well, I do sense that we haven't moved far enough, certainly, for what a lot of countries would have liked to have seen. I'm optimistic, and I'm hoping we'll see substantial progress on this topic over the coming years.
So from my point of view, I think the topic of loss and damage, also as Philip put it, it's nothing new. It has been on the negotiation agenda for years, and the colleagues, especially from the global South countries, have made this crystal clear that also this COP26 in Glasgow would be one of the major forums to discuss this, and it will be in the future as well. So I wouldn't also entertain too much of a forward-looking, but more of a sort of contextual look at the facility that has been asked for. I think the loss and damage recognition, the Paris Agreement, is already there. So the question is how to draw conclusions from this, how to make this operationable, and if there's a need for not only the need for financing, but also the means to do so. So the loss and damage facility discussion certainly sparked some buzz in the last days of the COP, as this concrete proposal was put forward in the last 3 or 4 days in the second week of the COP. But the discussions are quite old, actually. And also the global North countries are very mindful of potential obligations for damages which could go into billions of dollars. So looking at the facility from a point of timing, there are at least financial facilities in the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement processes, for instance, like the CTCN. And there's, for instance, the Climate Technology Center Network, which is the operational arm of the UNFCCC technology mechanism that took almost 10 years to set up. So looking at loss and damage facility and the need for immediate financing, we need to also be clear how this can be implemented quite quickly. So setting up a dialogue is only a first step, and I think all parties are quite aware this need to set this up quickly. I think from what I perceived from sort of a national perspective, there is indeed willingness by several countries to contribute substantial sums already in the short term. So we really need to see which instrument might be the most feasible to make this action and these payments happen, to set up the somewhat loss and damage discussions on a more stable ground, and then continue the discussions how to institutionalize them in the process. But that's something that we'll need to follow up closely in the next year, leading up to the next COP27 in Egypt.
Thank you both. If I may just come back to you both on what I've heard there. You've talked about implementing and talking about the principle as being quite important here. And Philip, you mentioned that you have a degree of optimism here. And Arne, you mentioned about how to make sure that we make this operational. Is the amount of money that we're talking through such loss and damage financial facilities enough? Or is the fact that the principle is established or is becoming more established more important than the sums of money that we're talking about? And I say this because there is the example here in the UK where we're talking about needing trillions of British pounds in order to get to net zero by 2050. And that's in the UK alone, never mind billions for everybody here. So Philip, may I just come back to you on that, please?
My optimism on this issue is more grounded, as you mentioned, in sort of the principles and the fact that we've got a structure to move this process forward. The sums of money that we're talking about with regards to loss and damage, in addition to the many other issues that we have within the finance discussions, those sums are massive, and we haven't gotten there yet. And I'm not sure we'll get there in the near future, although we are making progress. With that said, what I see and base my optimism on is the fact that we've had more constructive discussions on these topics at the most recent COP than I've seen in past years, and countries' willingness to increase their overall climate finance targets. So I take that as a positive, but it's a very sober perspective as well to realize that we certainly aren't at what's needed, what, say, science would call for in terms of the amount of funds that are needed to address the impacts of climate change. We certainly haven't got there.
And Arne, how is your take on this issue?
I think I can follow Philip here as well. It's not that we don't have the commitment to funding just yet, but it's certainly not enough already on the mitigation and adaptation side. And if you include loss and damage as sort of a side of adaptation, clearly there is the need to do more and to do better. And I think that's also one of the outcomes of COP26, where the cover decisions acknowledge the fact that the commitments of 100 billion a year by developed countries have been falling short, and regrettably so. We do have the Green Climate Fund, we do have the Adaptation Fund, and both of them have been upscaling climate finance quite a bit in recent years. I mean, the Adaptation Fund alone, if I'm not mistaken, has over 850 million US dollars allocated, starting from much smaller routes some 10 years back. So this is really, once the instruments are in place and the political commitments are voiced, and parties are being held to them, I think then really the upscaling is much easier. What you touched upon in your question, having the principle established that there's the need to not only talk about this in the negotiations, but also find a concrete framework and footing and some instrument to implement the financing, wherever or whatever that might be. That is really a very important first step. And really just that, a first step, but an important one.
Thank you. Arne, you mentioned the global north's wariness about opening up this discussion to potential obligations for damages running into the billions. I look to the investment, the decision to decarbonize South Africa, the decision that was made by many countries to work in decarbonizing South Africa's electricity system. Is that perhaps a preferred model of working from the global north? And is this perhaps something that we will see more rather than investment through such a loss and damage financial facility?
To be quite frank, I haven't read the declaration just yet on this, so I can't go into specifics on this. I think the wariness leads or goes back to the attribution of damages. I think that's really where the legal concepts are at heart. And if you look at the Paris Agreement's language, which was carefully phrased, it is that parties recognize the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, and reducing that risk, but it doesn't immediately sort of create that sort of liability. So this is, I think, what is enshrined in the Paris Agreement, and where global North countries and parties will definitely hold firm onto. Having said that, the willingness and the acknowledgement of damages and the losses are there. So I think it's really the question who determines the speed and sort of the amount of financing. I think that's a matter of control and also of commitment, and that taps into a discussion that we're seeing in the climate negotiations already for several years. Also, when it comes to the ex ante reporting of finance, for instance, regarding the commitments and their implementation in general, also on mitigation and adaptation. This is something where states and also finance ministries are very well aware of what they can commit to, but where they also tap into future legislators' responsibilities. So I think that's really at the balance. Who can decide and for how long in the future to commit to something, especially when we see maybe different legislators in the future, different priorities in financing as well. And so this long-term commitment can really be followed through. So we need a mix of reliability for those who receive those funding. So what we need is a balance between the reliability of commitments and also the security for those states who commit that they actually will be able to follow through with their own commitments.
Yeah, I was thinking about this a little bit more and sort of where we go on loss and damage. And I come back to it is often a political discussion, and that hesitancy from the global North countries, as Arne allocated, is very entrenched. And there's a lot of reluctance, I think, to dig in on this issue. And so that's why we have sort of very broad level discussions. So I really am interested, frankly, to see where it goes and how we're able to sort of break down some of those barriers. And are we going to have the more constructive and detailed discussions on loss and damage through this new facility that frankly have been missing, but have been called for by the developing countries for a number of years. So to them, it's not political. To them, it's life and death in situations. We saw the speeches being made with people up to their knees in water, participating virtually in the COP. And that's real life, and that's every day. And so I think that despite the hesitancy of some global North countries, this issue is going to be increasingly front and center as we move to the next COP and the one subsequent as well.
Moving forward on this issue of finance, there was a lot of emphasis placed at the COP on the importance of finance at the event. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England and a fellow Canadian, Philip, launched the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which claimed to have mobilized $130 trillion of capital committed to net zero. And at the same time, the UK government also launched its Green Finance Roadmap, which was aiming at establishing London as the world's first net zero financial centre, something which, of course, cities like New York and Paris and Frankfurt might want to rival. It is very clear that finance, private finance, is going to be a big part of making sure that we get to our climate ambitions. What do we need to do to follow through on these rather big commitments? And what will happen in different countries around the world to make this happen?
Thanks. And I think that there's a couple of things that we need to be on the lookout for with regards to these financial commitments. And it also relates to one of the other big outcomes from the COP, and that is the final agreement on the elaboration of Article 6, which is in regards to international markets for climate action. What I need to see, and what a lot of people are calling for, is a very high degree of accountability and transparency in these agreements, in these markets, in these investments, to ensure that there's additionality to some of the things that are going on, that there's that things like double counting in markets are strictly avoided, and that a lot of the investments are transparent. I have a bit of a second issue with some of these investment mechanisms as well. And that's when we start talking about net zero, how much focus we're putting on the net part of net zero. And what I want to see with finance is a significant focus on absolute emission reductions and approaches and policies, and not an over-reliance on very expensive technologies that might capture or abate emissions, but ultimately don't get us out of the problem, which is the need to have absolute reductions. So while there's room for things like offset markets and investments in technology to abate emissions, what I think we need is a real focus on the actions that are going to have the best benefit and have the biggest impact in terms of those emissions reductions that we need to achieve things like 1.5. The other thing that we can't lose mind of, and that we've talked about a little bit earlier, is this balance between investment in climate change mitigation and investment in climate change adaptation. And historically, the investments in mitigation have far outpaced what's needed in adaptation. So when we talk about green finance, I want to make sure we don't lose the view that we need a very substantial upscaling of funding in climate change adaptation. Traditionally, that hasn't been as major a focus for the private sector as it has been for climate change mitigation. That might mean that we need a rebalance between where private sector funds are likely to go, which has been historically more mitigation, but then we rebalance that with a stronger focus with public funds on adaptation, so that we don't lose that balance and risk over investing in one area where there's a very strong need in the other as well.
Touching upon your question regarding what will happen in other economies and countries, I think from an EU perspective, and also in the context of the EU Green Deal, which is planning to invest also sizable sums in the future in climate action, the EU has also developed a taxonomy regulation on environmentally sustainable economic activities. So that's been a focus until the last year. Now we still have implementing acts being released throughout this year and coming some more up in the next to define the criteria. And I think that this is really where it comes to the crunch issues, because of course there you have widely different perceptions of what constitutes do no significant harm, as the taxonomy regulation puts it. And right now, I think in July, the report came out from an expert group regarding the assessment of nuclear energy, for instance. And there, especially also in the EU even, you'll have heated discussions whether the climate aspects or also other environmental impacts, to which extent they need to be assessed and then considered as being sustainable. So I think that's really where the discussion is at.
Thank you, Arne. We saw many announcements and pledges touching on different topics at COP26, such as on coal, on deforestation, on methane. We also have several unknowns about how these will be implemented and how transparent and how verifiable delivery of these promises will be. How credible are these pledges? And do you think countries pushing for change will be able to secure real action?
You mentioned three of the initiatives that I would like to touch upon. So methane, deforestation, and coal. Maybe let me start with methane. I think that's really needs to be assessed step by step. And there are very different groups of states and parties who signed up for these different initiatives. So I think it's also important to have a look at the composition of those signatories. But starting with methane, it's really I think, something where we can see the most concrete steps, because methane is also a greenhouse gas, which is covered by the basket of 6 greenhouse gases under the UNFCCC. So it's nothing new. There are initiatives like the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which have been working on regional and local methane reduction commitments in the past. So there's a lot of expertise. There's a lot of knowledge about how to account for these emissions. They are reported regularly. So there, I think, the footholds are there to really build on these concrete commitments and look to the implementation and also see some sizable impacts. Second and third would be then deforestation and coal. I think maybe starting with coal here, also seeing there, coming from Germany, a different discussion between the last government, which is in its last week, basically, and the incoming government, which is where we already looking at an overhaul of the timeline to phase out coal, pulling this up from 2038 to ideally 2030, as it's phrased now. So this is really something where countries and states are developing quickly. And jumping back to original question, the commitments voiced at COP26 regarding the phase out of coal have to be seen in the national context. It's easier to phase out coal if you have 4 coal power plants. It's much more difficult if you have 30 or more. Lastly, on deforestation, I think that is an important part, because it's not quite as big of a topic in the technical negotiations to the same extent. There are lots of discussions, of course, on the role of forestry and land use within these discussions. But I think a big commitment in terms of deforestation, and also, as far as I followed that, earmarking funds for the indigenous peoples who are basically governing many of these areas which are affected. I think these are important political commitments. But to be honest, these are very large sums. They need to be, first of all, not just committed, but also being made available through different institutions, different funds, and then put to good use. So I think this is really where some more reporting and monitoring will be needed to see if those commitments are really implemented. So from the 3 that you mentioned, I think this is really something where the most work needs to be done.
My area of focus traditionally has been on fossil fuels and just transition. And so with regards to some of these agreements, that's where I invested most of my time to focus. And I was actually talking to somebody from the labor movement about the proliferation of these commitments on fossil fuels and things like just transition. And my sort of feeling that some of them were grounded in sort of the definitions and guidelines from organizations such as the ILO, where there's a basis and a framework to begin. But then also there are other agreements that sort of seem to redefine or change the definition of some of these agreed terms. And they had those same sort of concerns. They're cautiously optimistic. Obviously, it's great to see these announcements and countries commit to phase out coal or phase out fossil fuels. We have announcements, for example, like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is stopping the extraction, exploration of fossil fuels right at the source, which is essentially the end game of the leave it in the ground narrative. So I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm also going to be paying very close attention over the next 6 to 12 months to see which of these very many announcements will lead to real action and real progress, and which might lose the luster once the spotlight fades. I think the next 6 to 12 months will be really telling in which of these pledges will translate to action and which won't. We also have to be very wary of things like the terms that come out called greenwashing and astroturfing, where basically groups or interests that want to attach a green message or a green sheen to what they're committing, but in the end, their motives aren't necessarily consistent with the communications and the spotlight and the announcements. And we have to ensure that the pledges are real and have a real, honest and sincere motivation behind them. And that wasn't necessarily easy at the COP because of the proliferation in these announcements and some of the redefining of terms that many people might consider agreed, but have different meanings for different segments of those who are participating at the COP.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Arne. This has been a fantastic discussion. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for today, but thank you to both of you for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us. We'll be back with more podcasts, so stay tuned. If you want to read more about our work or the work of the Think Sustainable Europe, check out our website at ieep.eu. Thank you for listening.